Good evening. I'm David Levine, co-chair of Science Writers in New York. I want to thank Joseph Bonner, who's making this easy for me, so he's producing it. My guest tonight is Gerald Posner. He's a journalist. He's the author of 13 acclaimed books, including New York Times nonfiction bestsellers Case Closed, Why America Slept, and God's Bankers. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer in History. The New York Times has his latest book, which is Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America, published last March, was a withering and encyclopedic indictment of a drug industry that often seems to prioritize profits over patients. It reads like a pharmaceutical version of Cops and Robbers. So a little housekeeping. If you have a question, please put them in the Q&A box. Don't put them in the chat box because that's just for the three of us who are operating this. And so nice to see you again. Welcome. And so I just in the news, they just announced the CDC guidelines for the vaccines. And so what do you think?
I don't think there were any surprises in there. The advisory committee was, very, very careful. They're looking at those frontline medical workers that have a possibility of getting infected themselves or dealing with infectious agents or with COVID patients. And then, of course, the long-term care homes and rest homes where 40% of the deaths have taken place. So that makes sense. And they're not going to have enough of that vaccine in December, even with Pfizer and a little bit of Moderna with emergency use to get it even to those first two groups. So everything else will follow.
Okay. So there was also news today that United Airlines is gearing up to fly the planes and others and stuff like that. So what are your thoughts? I mean, some people are really, really excited, and I think this is going to be the answer to everything. And, some people say to me, I guess I'll get it next month. And I said, you're not getting it next month unless you're a healthcare worker or in a nursing home.
Yeah, no, David, it's interesting. I mean, first of all, it's just as a sidelight, you mentioned United Airlines was flying. You're right. They came in from Brussels. They came in, they're bringing in some of the Pfizer vaccine. And by the way, the planes that are getting the permission to fly these cargo planes, and it includes both Delta and some of American and United, Lufthansa and others, they have to get permission from the FAA here and in flight authorities in their own countries to carry above what the normal weight restrictions are for dry ice, because so much dry ice is needed for the Pfizer vaccine to be able to bring it around to keep it at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, that's colder than any temperature that's ever been on any land in the United States, including Alaska. So when you're dealing with the Pfizer vaccine, a lot of it is weight just to be able to make sure that it can get there. When you say, people have a different view of it, I talk every day to people about the vaccine and get a feeling for what they think. And I think that some are absolutely afraid of it. They think it's been rushed and this is a speed record. You understand that, land speed record to get a vaccine done. It's fantastic timing. This is the best part of the pharmaceutical study. This is where they are brilliant in the lab sometimes. But that fear will keep some people away, and other people have an unrealistic expectation that the vaccine is a cure-all, that it means that once the vaccine starts to come out in large numbers in the spring, they can go back to a pre-COVID normal. And that's far from assured. We're dealing with vaccines that in the lab and in clinical trials are showing a good deal of efficacy. We won't know what the real world effectiveness is until we get it out in millions of numbers. We don't know yet if these vaccines, although they do appear to be very effective in terms of preventing you getting the worst symptoms of COVID and ending up seriously ill, they do a bit of triage. They keep you away from eventually the emergency room or maybe the intensive care unit. We don't know if they stop you from transmitting the disease if you happen to get infected with COVID to another person. So if we find out that you can still infect somebody else after you've gotten a vaccine, if you happen to get sick with COVID or you had it before, we'll still be wearing masks and doing 6 feet distancing. Nobody will be very happy about having to take a vaccine and still doing that. So I don't think that it's an easy cure-all just to assume you're going to get the vaccine and that will be the end of it. It's a step to making sure that you don't end up as a statistic in the worst possible case of COVID and having complications for it. For a lot of people, it's going to make sense. And I think that as the winter gets worse with COVID infections, people who are now on the fence may decide they will go ahead and try a vaccine when it comes out.
So we were talking a little bit about the fact that both Pfizer's vaccine and Moderna's, and then we'll talk about AstraZeneca. You said that they expect side effects about 17%.
No, I mean, Shingrix, the shingles vaccine is, that many people have who are over 65 has a 17% side effect profile. The mRNA, these messenger RNA, these messenger DNA vaccines for Moderna and for Pfizer, they're revolutionary. I mean, they've been the promise for 20 years, and no company's ever been able to develop it. And all of a sudden, we have two that are on the verge of getting emergency use authorizations for it. So the great thing about them, they can be made in the test tube. There's some difficulty in deploying and distributing them, which we can talk about later, mainly in terms of temperature, especially the Pfizer vaccine. But they do have a higher sort of, what I call reactogenicity, the effects of this, the short-term effects. You are going to feel sick sometimes from it. There's no doubt about that. In the Pfizer vaccine and in the Moderna vaccine, about 2% in each of those who received the real vaccine, had what they call a spiking fever to 39.4, 40 Celsius. So it's about 104 degrees. You had in the Moderna vaccine, about 9% reported joint pain or muscle pain. Another 8% had serious headaches that bothered them. A smaller percentage of that with Pfizer. But we say 2% get 104 fever. Now, that doesn't sound so bad, but now you give it the vaccine to 50 million people. That means 1 million people are going to be spiking to 104 fever. They need to know that they can take Tylenol and get that fever down. If there's transparency about the vaccine when you go in, you may have a short-term effect that's going to be transient. It's going to be gone in a day or so. And the payoff for that is that you will have some protection with your body's own antibodies and T cells against COVID. You're not going to end up dying of COVID. You're not going to end up in the emergency room. And so that's the trade-off for some people.
Now, what happened with AstraZeneca's vaccine? Because there was some people got 2 equal doses, some people got half a dose, and then a second full dose, and that wasn't planned.
The great part of the AstraZeneca mistake is that the mistake turns out to be the good part of the vaccine trial. One overall comment on AstraZeneca, and I spent 5 years looking at the pharmaceutical industry, and they're one of the companies that I look at. AstraZeneca does not have a long history, much expertise in dealing with vaccines, and that's pretty evident in the way that they've rolled this out. They haven't provided the information that Pfizer and Moderna were on top of, especially Pfizer. They really know how to do this very well in terms of supplying the information, so there's some transparency on what's happening with the trials. What happens with AstraZeneca is you have 8,900 volunteers essentially in Brazil, and another 2,000 plus in Britain. And the group in Britain is getting only half a dose by mistake for the first shot. They're supposed to get a full dose, and then they get a full dose for the second shot. In that group, there's about 90% efficacy. Of course, it turns out there's a footnote to that, which AstraZeneca hadn't said. All of those people were 55 and younger. So we don't know how it would actually be in people over 55. In the groups that were above 55, which were the 9,000 in Brazil, there you had a lower 62% efficacy rate. And what AstraZeneca did is they mixed the two together. So it was hard to pick out which ones were British and which ones were Brazilian. They didn't show it very, very clearly. And there is some speculation. I spoke to somebody today, as a matter of fact, an epidemiologist, who said, look at what they're doing, this type of viral vector vaccine, which is a traditional one, what AstraZeneca is doing, essentially basing it on this idea of the adenovirus virus, a common cold virus. They're doing it on chimpanzee virus. If that virus seems similar to what you already have seen in your body, in your immune system may react to that virus. That virus is carrying, the adenovirus is carrying the little spike protein that you need from the coronavirus into your body, so your body can then be vaccinated and respond to the coronavirus if you get it. It's almost like a delivery truck bringing it in. But if the delivery truck, the adenovirus happens to be recognized by the body will respond to that with its own inflammatory response, and that will ruin the delivery process of the actual spike protein, which is the purpose of being protected against COVID. So there's some speculation that they may have to synthetically work on changing the underlying virus that they're trying to inject into the body to make it a little bit better on the full dose regimen. And that's still playing out. They're not going to be approved here. By the way, they aren't being approved in the US for some time. The US, it was actually a separate entity in the United States that spotted the problem with their vaccine trial in the first place. It wasn't even AstraZeneca. And that's a shame because theirs is the cheapest, $3 to $4 a dose. A British tabloid called it I think it was Vaccine, like a cappuccini. It was a cappuccino. It was so cheap. And that's the one that's being made with 1 billion doses in India. That's the one that could be spread around the developed world, undeveloped world, the third world, because its cost is so cheap, but it's going to be a little slower.
So Pfizer did not invent this vaccine. It was invented by basically a small biotech husband and wife team.
Yeah.
So which of these vaccines do you like?
I like the efficacy of the mRNA vaccines. There's no question that if you're looking just in terms of what might be the most effective vaccines, it's going to be those vaccines. And between those two, I tend to like the Pfizer vaccine a little bit more than Moderna, only for one reason. Its side effect profile is running about half of the Moderna's. So if you're looking for the RNA vaccine, you're looking then probably at Pfizer at this time. It's going to be a little bit harder to find in some ways because of the limitations on its temperature settings, and that means it's not going to be everywhere. But if you're looking for a general vaccine, what I call like the influenza shot, you get an influenza shot every year. If you get one of those, last year was only 39% effective, which was one of the worst years ever. But even on good years, it's 60 to 70% effective. Then you're in the same ballpark as AstraZeneca, with probably less of a side effect profile, more of site injection soreness, maybe a little bit of fever, but a lower fever. You're not going to have that same robust immune system response to the shot. And it may not give you as full protection, but it will have a lower trade-off in terms of effects on you and adverse effects.
So going back to the shingles vaccine, there was an earlier shingles vaccine, which was not as effective. And then there was Shingrix, which is 93% effective. Do you think that these are the first vaccines and that we're going to build on these?
Yes, absolutely. Look, I mean, everybody, well, I say everybody, but most of the large companies, Sanofi, others, the Merck, Lilly, they are watching this and salivating in some ways about the possibility of what this could open up. Because if these messenger RNA vaccines are successful, and successful means that once they are distributed to millions and millions, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people, there's no side effect that develops that we're not aware of now, no serious side effect, nothing like, Guillain-Barré that developed in 1976 when the swine flu was given out in the United States to 40 million people, and some 5,000 cases above the norm developed as a result of that as neurological symptoms. As long as there's nothing like that, the promise for the messenger RNA is that you may be able to, as a pharma company, design specific delivery mechanisms in the future so that one vaccine might be able to replace 6, 7, or 10 childhood vaccines in one. They may also they've been looking for a long time at the possibility. HIV has proven very, very difficult because of the degree, as you know, to which the underlying virus continues to mutate so fast that we finally have something in 2019 that's been good for the Ebola. But I think that there's a whole host of materials, including cancers, that you will see messenger RNA used more and more for.
All right, so let's talk about so when a company says they have 95% efficacy, that's not based on every person who took part. How many people is that based on? Because in Pfizer, it was pretty low, actually.
Yeah, I mean, so It's not a surprise. It's a real figure, and you understand it. I mean, I look at it and I'm impressed by that figure. But I think that the average person out there, if you stop 10 people on the street and you tell them, by the way, Pfizer's vaccine is 95% effective, they would think that that means if you give it to 100 people, 95 are going to get protected. And as you know, that's not the case at all. Pfizer on that particular study they wanted over 100,000. They ended up with 43,000 running through that phase of the trial. In the end, 170 people tested positive for coronavirus. And 162 of those, it turned out, were in the group that had been given the placebo. So only 8 ended up being in the group that had been given the real vaccine. So what they do at that point, and there's nothing hidden about this, is a transparent process. It's been around for decades. It's always the same. They take the small number, the 8 that had developed it within the vaccine group. They come up with the fraction for that versus the whole. And they do the same thing with the number of people who got it in the placebo group. And then they do a relative fraction between those two. And that's how they come up with the 95%. And really, it's 95% efficacy. That's what it shows inside the clinical trial. And that's still an impressive number. But effectiveness, which is what the lay public thinks it is, that's only proven. We only know that after the fact. Once you start to give it in millions and millions of doses. And most of the time, put the mRNA aside for a second. For most vaccines, the actual clinical trials show more promise than once it's given into the general population. The reason for that is the people often volunteering to be test volunteers are not the sickest people. They aren't people like those who might be in an aged home or with all types of comorbidities. So you tend to get a slightly healthier group of people in the test volunteers. The numbers may drop a little bit. And one last thing to remember, when they say 170 people in Pfizer, for instance, tested positive for coronavirus, they aren't testing everyone. People think they tested all 43,000, not at all. You only get tested if you have a symptom that might be coronavirus related. So for instance, if you have a headache or fever, it is possible, everybody agrees with this, but we don't know what it means. It is possible that you would miss asymptomatic coronavirus infections. If those asymptomatic coronavirus infections were in the group that have been given the vaccine, then you're understating that efficacy, not for the individuals who get the vaccine because they still feel fine, but you can still spread the vaccine at that point. So the vaccine may not stop you from spreading it. That's something we're just not clear on. It's just another wrinkle to the 95% effectiveness. It's not nearly as clean cut as the headlines in the newspaper will lead you to believe.
So when I hear 50,000 people took part in a trial, but the data is only based on 170 people, that makes me think, I don't know. It's not a lot of people.
Well, no, it's not a lot of people. And look, I agree with that. People say to me all the time, I'm not going to be first in line. I say, well, you won't be first in line because the people who have been first in line are those who have been the test volunteers. They've been right. Doing this in several 100,000. And, think about this. We're talking only 15,000 on AstraZeneca in the latest round, but 43,000 on Pfizer. You have another 50,000 almost on Moderna's. The Russians on Sputnik V, Sputnik 5, have tested on some 60,000 people, not all of them in a clinical testing trial, but a number in Western Russia. The Chinese on their vaccine have tested, they claim, on more than 100,000, including some frontline workers that aren't necessarily in a controlled environment. So they're not doing it against a placebo. But you have a lot of people who are getting the equivalent of these, viral vector or messenger RNA vaccines. And as we get more, we'll start to see if there are side effects. Look, if you go to somebody who's involved in vaccine production and you say to them, by the way, I want to talk to you off the record. Tell me what theoretically could be a risk to the mRNA vaccine that we are not seeing. Just want to know the theory of it. They will tell you, if they're having an honest moment, that they don't know if the immune response that it causes that couldn't maybe provoke a spike for people who are battling lupus. Lupus, your autoimmune system is attacking your genetic code. So here you have an mRNA vaccine that delivers this spike protein by essentially, coming in with this lipid nanoparticle. We know that when those lipid nanoparticles are injected into animals without an mRNA vaccine, they cause that inflammation and inflammatory response. So if you trigger that inflammatory response in a larger way in the system, could you affect people who have rheumatoid arthritis or other autoimmune diseases? They don't believe so. But the jury is out. We'll know after 300 million people have gotten it, and we look back a year later and say, boy, that was fantastic. No effect at all. Or, gee, not so great if you happen to have lupus. I'm just not sure. So there are some categories of people. I might say if I was somebody battling lupus, I might go for the old-fashioned vaccine, what I call the viral vector vaccine from AstraZeneca, even if it's not going to be quite as effective, because that's less chance of causing a problem with my immune system.
Okay, so the Pfizer vaccine, 94 degrees, you can't get that at CVS pharmacy, you can't get that at Walgreens. So someone said, what about vaccines on the horizon which only need regular refrigeration?
I mean, that's AstraZeneca, only regular refrigeration, good for 6 months. So it's fantastic. And its price is unbelievable because they are the only pharmaceutical company that has promised not to make a profit while the pandemic's on. Now, I don't know what that means while the pandemic is going, but at some point we'll get into fighting over the definition. But it means that at least while COVID is closing things down and we have these spikes around the world, they don't intend, they say, to make a profit on it. They expect to make a profit in the future based upon the fact that governments will have to stockpile their vaccine if it's very effective. And in addition, you will need booster shots. Even, we thought in the beginning that only the messenger RNA vaccines would need booster shots. And that's because mRNA lasts very, very quickly, dissipates very fast when it goes into the body. So there's no question that once that went in, you would need a booster shot. Moderna, I think, is 21 days after, 28 days on Pfizer. And maybe the second shot would carry you, we don't know for how long, 4 months, 6 months, 9 months. The rule in the United States used to be with the FDA that you couldn't have a vaccine approved unless it gave you 1 year of immunity. Now, the influenza vaccine doesn't really do that, but these vaccines will clearly come in under that. However, AstraZeneca's more traditional vaccine also is a 2-shot regimen, as we discussed before. So they look at their profit in the future. They're pricing it very, very well. They can last 6 months in a regular refrigerator. So will Novavax and so will Sanofi. They have slightly different models, what I call the synthetic versions that are really built up in like insect seeds that they end up transporting in. It's a slightly different method, but they also can last 6 to 7 months in a refrigerator. Those are the ones you're going to see all through the developed world. And
so I have a related question. So far, I have not heard a single manufacturer or government official or a business executive discuss the cost per dose for these vaccines. If the government is paying for the doses, how do they decide which one to buy and how much to pay? If people decide they want a different vaccine outside the government program, how much will they pay? And if the regimen requires 2 doses, will I need one every year?
Working backward, if it requires 2 doses, do you need one every year? Some drug companies may hope that's the case. It would be a great revenue stream if you were able to build in $5 to $10 billion a year in business that you knew was steady, like the influenza vaccine. But I don't think that will happen here, because when we do get to that magic number for so-called herd immunity, which can only really be had through the vaccine in this case, 65 to 70% of people is the estimate, need to have it in order for the virus to stop spreading. At that point, essentially, there's not enough people who are fresh victims to it, so we don't see it really spreading it in. You may be able to do without the vaccine booster every year. What about if you want a different vaccine? What if you've done all your research, David, and you go in to your local Walgreens and you say, hey, you've got the special $20,000 suitcase that Pfizer has worked on to develop that lets you have this vaccine here for 10 days. By the way, that's the most you can have it. It's 10 days. They put it into a $20,000 suitcase. This suitcase is really the size of a small refrigerator that can carry 1,000 to 5,000 doses. They then ship that. Shipping can take up to 4 days. This entire life in this sort of what they call refrigerated suitcase is 10 days. You're supposed to open it up no more than twice a day for 3 minutes at a time. And then you can start to distribute the vaccine. Australia, this is a sidelight, if anybody is listening from Australia, Australia has already acknowledged on the record that it has no ability to make an mRNA vaccine itself. It doesn't have the capacity in terms of its own production facilities, and it doesn't have the deep freeze capacities to be able to store them. So they need Pfizer, if they take the Pfizer vaccine, to get it to Australia and to distribute it within that 10-day period. But you walk into Walgreens, you've done your research, you don't want it because you have lupus or whatever else and don't want to take the risk. You want the AstraZeneca vaccine. You're not going to be able to get it very possibly. You don't have that choice. It's not as though you can say, okay, I want to pay for it. It's not covered here by the federal government. It's not covered by my insurance company. I'd like to pay for it $20 out of pocket. I understand the government is buying the AstraZeneca vaccine for $4 a dose, which is true, 1.2 billion for 300 million doses. I'll pay the $4 for it, but it may not be available. The suppliers who are putting out the vaccines, the hospitals, the clinics, the state and local governments, the health community services, they're going to lock on to one vaccine. That's the one they're going to be given. You're not going to have a menu choice of several when you go in. You may have to look around a little bit. Maybe you can travel. Maybe there's another clinic or another hospital not far away that will have another one. But the choice will be very, very limited.
Do you think the vaccine will be recommended for people who already had COVID-19, whether or not they had symptoms? And were any of these individuals, including the trials? And if not, might there be any safety concerns? The
general consensus of, and you won't be surprised at this, of the pharmaceutical companies, I include the whole group on this, some have been more vocal than others, some talk about it more behind the scenes. They're all in favor of ensuring that those people who have already tested positive for COVID will be able to get the vaccine, because they are accumulating the evidence of a small but growing number of people who show a second infection, which indicates to them, and is pretty convincing evidence, that the immunity that you get in the body to COVID, once you get it, even if you were without symptoms or whether you were fairly sick and ended up in the hospital, doesn't last forever. It may last for only that 8 months. We're in a period now of 9 to 10 months. So people who are getting reinfected were those who often were sick in March or April. And if they were getting sick in October or November, again, that 6-month period, that indicates that a vaccine might be able to actually help them.
Okay. Will the companies share their formulations to produce the vaccine with the best storage conditions, cheapest price, greatest efficacy across multiple subpopulations and cohorts?
Oh, from your mouth to God's ears, that would be fantastic. I mean, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemics and Pandemics, and that out of Norway, the Norway-based coalition, which had this grand idea in 2015 that they'd be able to coordinate the international response to something like a pandemic and make sure that all the drug companies around the world globally started to work together in this wonderful way of sharing research information and making sure that the prices were affordable. But here, everybody's been chasing their own product. They haven't shared information. They're not helping in terms now of the distribution or logistics issues in terms of keeping the temperature right of that. And they all have a different stake in it. Look at Moderna received about $1 billion in federal funding. The federal government spent over $9 billion so far to drug companies. The only drug company that's in the forefront, right in the advance of having a vaccine almost ready, is Pfizer. They haven't taken any money. They're the only ones of the group. They took no federal money. But Moderna took $1 billion and then also came to an agreement to sell their vaccine 100 million doses for about 1.5 billion to the government. So they're getting $15 a vaccine plus the $1 billion they got on research. Pfizer took no money up front. They're getting paid 1.95 billion for 100 million doses. So they're getting $19.50 a dose. No one knows the cost, the real cost to manufacture of the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine. They would both tell you that they have a lot of overhead, a lot of research and development on this crash effort, and that's true, distribution costs and all. So it's more than just manufacturing, but the estimates from those who see how they are built and done is $8 to $9 is probably their cost. So they might be picking up 50% to double on the sales. Whereas for AstraZeneca, they are pricing at what they say is cost, and that ranges between $3 and $4 each. AstraZeneca did get money from the government. It received almost 1.2 billion, but as part of that deal, the government bought 300 million doses. So that's where the $4 each. Novavax, by the way, which is doing the insect carrier to get the vaccine into you, they've never had a product to market as Moderna never had. They've received, I think, the most, 1.5 billion in federal funding, and they have 100 million doses being sold at less than $10 each. So you get more money from the government. The government gives you less on paying for the vaccine, but you're still making a profit. That profit incentive has given encouragement to all of these companies. They're all in a good race, and we're not going to end up with one vaccine, as you know. We're going to end up with 3, 4, 5, or 6. Competition is good in the end run.
Okay. So someone asked, would I have an easier time getting the vaccine as someone over 65 or as someone with a comorbidity?
Over 65 and a comorbidity, you're in like Flint. You'll be near the front of the line if you want to get a vaccine. Over 65 without a comorbidity, you may fall actually at a lower level of need than somebody who happens to be 30, is clinically obese, suffers from diabetes and hypertension. They would be at much greater risk, even though they're much younger than the 67 or 70-year-old who doesn't have hypertension or diabetes. So it's not a matter. We think everybody over 65 will automatically be near the front of the line once they start to go beyond medical workers and those in care homes. But those who are younger, who have serious comorbidities, those are also the ones at greater risk, and they may be further along, further up the line to get a vaccine than just an older person in relatively good health.
Okay. Do you foresee that a COVID vaccination will be required for children to enroll in schools and civil servant employees, for example, before being hired at a new job?
Wow, that's the great new frontier, and no one knows because it will depend on states. States will set the rules, and we see states right now, California, much stricter in terms of lockdowns, and where I live here in Florida, that's the difference between Governor DeSantis and Governor Newsom. I'm sure Governor DeSantis and Governor Newsom may have different takes on what you can do if you don't have a vaccine, or if you can go to school or not. Even the issue of going to school, as you know, is different from state to state. The CDC guidelines that we spoke about before, the recommendations for who should be first in line to get the vaccine, they are only recommendations. The CDC is likely to adopt those, but then they go to the states. The states can do what they want with it. You could have a governor say, you know what, I don't think it's so important to get those in care homes vaccinated. I'm going to put instead police and fire people ahead of that, emergency workers or frontline workers or essential workers. So the states are going to decide that. I think that what will happen, there was even talk early on when COVID first was raging in the spring, that you might need a vaccination certificate to be able to go on a flight. And the FAA would keep a list of that. Now, the FAA can't keep a list of the no-fly list, which has a couple 100,000 people on. They have people on the no-fly list who don't belong there. So I can't imagine they're going to be able to keep a 320 million person or 300 million person list of who is vaccinated and who's not. One last thing on that, David. As you're aware, in California, Oregon, Washington State, and some other places, there have been some cases, some instances in which people have been found to send their children to school where vaccinations were required, but the documents that they had that showed their children were vaccinated were in fact fake. Or they had been provided by a doctor who didn't believe in vaccines and was willing to write the note for them to show that they had it. So there will also be some level of fakery with people who will be able to hold up a certificate that said, I had the AstraZeneca vaccine. And it depends on how good the government is at monitoring that, if they'll be able to tell or not, even if they want to enforce a rule.
Okay. So Pfizer said they're putting, someone at Pfizer told me they're putting trackers on every vaccine because they are worried about things getting stolen. And they said, you know, on the New Jersey Turnpike, the Sopranos might just decide they need some vaccine.
It would seem like straight out of a movie. We laugh, but let me tell you, it's liquid to an extent, but it's like liquid gold because you're talking about something that could save people's lives. The people are are desperate at times for that. There's a black market, I'm sure, for that. There's no question about that. So they are guarding it jealously. You read with me the other day, we read a British article about the fact that MI5 in Britain was stopped a series of hack attacks by what they believe is North Korean intelligence on AstraZeneca in order to penetrate their computer system and get some of the vaccine information. So there are attempts by foreign governments to hack into the pharmaceutical companies. If the pharma companies like Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Sanofi, Novavax, if they're worried about being hacked for the information that they're developing because they're not sharing it, so people want that proprietary information, they also have to be worried about losing their vaccine once they go to distribute it on the road, and that would make perfect sense.
Okay, this is actually from Fred Mogul, who's with NPR. Do you anticipate that the category healthcare workers will include home healthcare aides, those who work across the spectrum of long-term care, not just nursing homes, but also assisted living centers and adult group homes for the disabled, and regular people who take care of elderly relatives?
There's no question in my mind that it should in every one of those instances, because those are all instances in which, if we're serious about bringing COVID under control, it's those healthcare workers, those volunteers, those family members who are dealing with elderly relatives, or patients, or care facilities who are in the risk of being able to contract the virus themselves from one of the people that they are dealing with. And so there's even, I heard the other day a good discussion in which what happens if the person who happens to be 90 years old and has a comorbidity and is a very high risk if they happen to get positive, isn't in a care home, but is living with you at your own home. It's your grandmother, it's your mother. And then do you get to the front of the line in so many ways to get vaccinated yourself? Yes, I think you do. And if that's not done, that would be a shame, because it can't just be medical workers as defined as those in hospitals and in ERs. Those people are on the front lines. I understand that they need to get it, but so do a whole host, as was just asked, of people who are dealing with those at greatest risk day in and day out as part of their work or in their home, and they should be at the top of that list.
Okay, how will the second doses be allocated? Will second doses be set aside for people who had the first dose?
Yes. And the reason I say yes with it's not exasperation, although it may sound like that, is because I'm not sure that it will be as smooth as the plan is. For instance, Pfizer's plan, and Moderna believes they can do this, they're going to be sending out these tens of millions of doses, 25, 30 million maybe in December. Remember, that's only 15 million people, 30 million doses, because you need 2 doses. So every time you hear they're going to have 100 million doses or 1 billion next year, Moderna says it can produce half a billion to 1 billion. Pfizer says we can do 1 billion. AstraZeneca says 2 billion. All of those have to be cut in half in terms of people because of the 2-dose regimen. Pfizer and Moderna believe that when they send these out, the clinics in those places that give the first dose out will then receive a second dose, because in Pfizer's case, the 10 days expires. So you need to send a new batch out, for instance, at 21 to 28 days. And the second batch will be allocated to those clinics and those patients who received the first dose. So you got your first dose in Kansas City at a clinic down the street on January the 10th. You're going to get your second dose in the first week of February at that same clinic. And I'm not sure how that's going to work if somebody moves, if they've traveled, if they're in another city at that time, if somebody in their family gets sick or passes away and they have to go to a funeral and the second dose has to be given then. So the logistical problem of trying to make sure that you not only give it to the same people, but you're going to distribute the same number of second doses, because they don't want to waste any of the doses. So they don't want the second doses to sit there to somebody who never got the first dose, because it's going to be useless. And they don't want it going to, they don't want the people who got the first dose to miss it, because then you're not going to the effectiveness of the vaccine. So this is easier said than done. We're watching this great experiment play out in front of us. The pandemic has made all of us, and all of us meaning the medical community, everybody connected to it, journalists who are reporting on it, the government, we're scrambling and learning for the first time. When this is over, we'll be brilliant. We'll be Monday morning quarterbacking, looking back and saying, oh, who could have ever thought that they could monitor the second dose by sending the same number to the same clinics? It's either going to work or not, but I'm hopeful that it will, but it seems very, very ambitious to me.
So these vaccines are going to go all over the world, not just the United States. Airlines I've lost my luggage many times in airlines, and I'm just wondering, are they going to lose my vaccine?
Yeah, that's fabulous. I am sure that you don't have to wait in line that long. A Pfizer representative won't have to wait in line that long at the lost vaccine luggage line at American Airlines. But I will say that the fact that they're trying to do these on cargo liners only. They don't have as many passenger jets flying, so the bellies of the plane aren't as open. And some of them, like United on these, are deciding to just have cargo jets alone. They're packed with dry ice in the terms of the Pfizer vaccine, so they know what they're transporting. And when they arrive at the locations, the distribution system is almost military-like, because Pfizer has the trucks waiting, the refrigeration units, the places receiving it to. Now, you get to the AstraZeneca vaccine, which doesn't need that same level of attention, needs refrigeration, is good for 6 months. Yes, there's no question. Listen, you know this. You're dealing with over 1 billion doses of 2 billion doses of vaccines eventually, hundreds of millions coming out as fast as possible. There are going to be glitches. You're going to turn on CNN, you're going to read the New York Times, and you're going to find instances in which we've either lost a batch of vaccine, or the second dose arrived and it was really the first dose, or they gave the half dose as they did with AstraZeneca. There will be some crazy stories out there. There'll be the exceptions, but they'll get the headlines. But it's inevitable that there are going to be some glitches along the way.
So here's a question. Has the safety and efficacy results been stratified by age? For example, do we know how effective the vaccines are for people under 40, 45, 65 to 69, 66 to 79, over 80?
They haven't broken it up as specifically as you have just mentioned it, and the way you just mentioned it is the way to do it, of course, because that's how we'd all like it. They have broken up in a more general sense. AstraZeneca didn't break it up at all, but Pfizer and Moderna, Pfizer a little bit better, provided information that said this was across all age groups. And then when they talk about the 2% rate of high fevers, or the 8.9%, let's say, in Moderna of joint pain, they aren't breaking it out by age groups. We would expect, as any journalist or any science or medical reporter or anybody else, I'd be surprised if the side effect profile wasn't a bit higher in older people. Your immune system gets weaker over time. It's one of the reasons we get a shingle vaccine, to boost the system's own ability to fight off that dormant virus that's now in the spine from the time you get exposed to it as a child. Immune system gets a little bit weaker. And that immune system can also, have a tougher time sometimes with vaccine doses. So I think that I would expect a higher adverse effect, transient effect profile on older recipients of the vaccine. I'll be surprised if that's not the case.
So you've been very critical of the pharmaceutical industry, and now you're saying, and when we talked, you said this is the pharmaceutical industry at its best. So
yeah, this is the good part. I mean, what I mean by that is I always thought, and what do I know? I'm only the writer. I always thought that the book that I worked on for 5 years was a look at the good and bad inside the industry, just like any industry. There's no industry that has everything perfect, and no industry that does everything wrong. And there is some brilliant innovation inside the laboratories. There's some amazing work taking place on targeted cancer cures. There's been amazing things in the past, from the penicillin project during World War II to the polio vaccine, to what happened with measles vaccines. Pharma has saved lives over the years. And there are also terrible stories about the opioid crisis and the way that sometimes very good companies have hidden information about side effects for years on the original birth control pill by Cyril and on HRT and the original products by that were put out by Wyeth for hormone replacement for women. They hid those bad results about endometrial cancer or blood clots for nearly 15 years. So there are bad stories and good stories. This is one of the good stories. I like this so far. Unless we all end up as dribbling idiots in a year and a half after getting the vaccine, I think this is one of the points where pharma is called on to do something in a time of international crisis. And they come through. Would I have preferred that they followed the CP rules and had all cooperated as they did during World War II when the federal government paid for all the penicillin programs and built the fermentation tanks and built the big production facilities for them, and nobody owned the patent and it was out there and the prices went down to near zero in no time at all? Sure, that would be fantastic. But it wasn't the way the governments approached it. So we get the next best thing, which is a profit-driven, reasonable profit-driven motive to be able to chase the vaccines. And it's working so far. We're getting these in record time at a time when a lot of people are getting a little weary of the pandemic, and we're not going to be out of it for a while. But this gives us a door to get out of it very possibly.
Well, it's actually getting worse in the United States, at least. And countries in Europe are going under lockdown.
Yeah, no, look at, I mean, my wife is an American citizen now, but she's originally from London. We have family, and she has family in the UK, and we see them through their second wave. They just finished their second wave of lockdowns. We have friends in Italy from work that I did on a book on finances at the Vatican, some of whom got infected with COVID the first time when it was ravaging the north of Italy. Now it's in the south in Calabria. And I just heard the other day a report on the BBC in which some of the health commissioners in the south of Italy had actually been arrested because they were selling favors to the mafia to do discounts and deals on COVID treatments at a time when hospitals are bursting over. So, you know, human nature knows no bounds at times to take advantage of a situation. And internationally, it's a problem. And we see COVID spiking. We're going to see it worse in the winter months, I'm sure, because people are indoors more and it's a little bit colder. And so if the numbers didn't go up, that would be a shock. It would be a sign that the virus was not replicating and not passing along and infectious as it was in the spring. So I think we'll see these numbers, and that's why the vaccine, when it finally comes out as an international solution, will be so welcome. Because look, you're looking for this in China, you're looking for it in Russia. India's biggest company is ready to produce 1 billion doses for distribution through South Asia. South America is clamoring for it. There's no country that's really looking out here and saying, by the way, we're off to the hook. So, you know, some have handled it a bit better than others, like Finland, but the population base is very, very tiny. But a lot of other countries are going through a bad spike and waiting for some medical relief.
What about better treatments, you know, for existing cases in the meantime? Is that happening also?
Yes, therapeutics are improving. Therapeutics. Thanks for asking that. Therapeutics tend to get lost in the glamour. The glamour drugs here are the vaccines. They get all the attention. But the therapeutics are clearly better. There was a time when look at the death rate has dropped, not because COVID. Some people say, oh, it's infecting younger people. Yes, more young have been infected with it, and they are sturdier immune systems. But in addition, it hasn't been the ravaging COVID that it was in Italy, where the death rate was 10%. Which is an astonishing figure. If it was 10% internationally in every country, we would be screaming for what was taking place. So the therapeutics have helped. We've learned not to intubate immediately. Don't go on a ventilator right away. And some of the novel, what I call the treatments from steroids to remdesivir to Gilead's treatment, they offer a whole range of possibilities now to keep you from eventually ending up as a mortality or ending up in intensive care, which you want to try to stay out of, even if you end up at the hospital. So I think those therapeutics are important. And one thing on that, David, I think that the public health officials view this about the vaccine. They don't view the vaccine as a cure, but they view it as a way to ensure that the pressure is taken off of the healthcare system so it's not broken. You know, we said don't break the system, you know, keep the curve going out so that we didn't have a crash that crashed all the emergency beds at once and there was no extra room in intensive care. the vaccine will help to do that. It will keep people away from the most serious developments of the disease, and as a result, will help in a way as therapeutics do.
So someone asked, do we treat prisoners? Do we treat members of hate groups, or even people who refuse to wear masks and live in red states? I mean, I think they're going to be, if you want it, you're going to be able to get it.
Absolutely. And, I had this discussion the other day with somebody about prisoners. I said, it's going to be distributed and prisoners will probably be a priority group. And this person was outraged. They said, they shouldn't, they're in prison. Why should they? And the reason they should is the same question was asked before by the NPR correspondent. What about individuals who are part-time workers, volunteers or that, with the elderly, who are going and treating with somebody who isn't even in an aged or care home, but happens to be in their own home and they're doing home visits or whatever? Well, there are workers inside of prison facilities. There are people who are working there as guards and as assistants and as wardens and as administrative staff. They go home every night to their families. And some of their families may have 80-year-old parents or grandparents there. They will have children there as well. So the place that you work at becomes the place where you are able then, if you get infected with a population that's highly infected, to bring the infection home and spread the infection within the community. So if we don't, and prisons are places because of the crowded conditions and because of the contact, you can't do 6 feet distancing all the time unless you're in solitary. So prisons are places where COVID has had very, very high rates of infections. And to the extent that they do, and those prisoners are not given a vaccine, and the people who work there aren't given the vaccines, will continue to spread it in the general community just for the employees.
So here's a question. To follow up on my question about specific types of healthcare workers, what about specific high-risk medical conditions? How detailed are those going to be by the ACIP recommendations? I guess we don't know yet, right?
We don't know yet how specific they will be. Now, saying that, we know that, for instance, there was some early anecdotal information and now tends to be a bit more persuasive that hypertension, especially runaway high blood pressure, could be a risk factor with COVID infections and could cause possibly long-term myocardial sort of weakness and problems down the road. So will hypertension be pushed ahead of diabetes? I'm not sure. It's above my pay grade in that sense, but I'm watching it. I think that those who make the recommendations, like the 15 people on this panel for the CDC and the CDC itself, will be loath to do that, to have specific recommendations based upon conditions, but they may give guidelines. As you know, the CDC is famous for giving guidelines that suggest to practitioners or dispensers or clinics or hospitals, these are the general guidelines for prioritizing among your patient population the issues. Obesity with hypertension, with diabetes jumps ahead of obesity. What about somebody who is going through cancer treatment? What about somebody who's receiving radiation? Could they get a vaccine? Maybe not a messenger RNA. We're not sure about those issues yet. So I think that those will be worked out, but they haven't been yet.
So Joe asked me this: how much leeway is acceptable regarding the date of getting one's second vaccine? How many days variation will there be? Does missing the best practice window for getting the second vaccine mean you have to start all over again?
So, great question for the procrastinators in our audience who definitely want to know that. If they get the first one, how long can they miss the second one by? And we don't know the answer to that yet. And the reason I say that is, for those of you who had the shingles vaccine, I've had the shingles vaccine, I've had Shingrix as well. They recommend that you take the second shot no sooner than 2 months after the first shot, but you could take it up to 4 or 5 months, maybe up to 6 months later. There's a window now. So we will eventually have a window on the second vaccine for when you can take it, especially on vaccines, the viral vector vaccines, the old traditional vaccines like AstraZeneca. They may have more of a fudge factor. The Moderna will have a bit of a fudge factor. The problem with the Pfizer vaccine, again, is going to be the delivery. There's such a short window. It's 10 days when they put that and lock it up in what they call their freezer suitcase and send it out to a distribution center in which it has to be used. And so if you're later than 10 days in getting that from your due date on the second shot, you may miss it.
Okay, so another question. We anticipate that distribution being somewhat more coordinated under President Biden than would have been under President Trump. But what does that mean in practical terms? How much difference will it make where you are and what your state government is like? We talked about that in Florida. Do you anticipate distribution being any more or less efficient in one state versus another? And then what should we as journalists look out for in the local, state, federal interface? What questions should we be asked to hold leaders accountable?
Yeah, I think that there's everybody. If you talk to state officials, and I try to get information here from state officials in Florida. I have friends who are doing the same up in New York, and state officials all say that they are on top of it. They're covering it. They're ready to go. The proof will be in the pudding. We won't know until we actually see it play out, and it will be interesting to see how fast. I mean, some of these issues will be out of what we should look for, I think, as journalists. Some of the issues will be out of state control, not when it comes to the poorest communities, not when it comes to the delivery to people who are covered on Medicaid or at local health clinics or community health centers, but the private pharmacies, the pharmaceutical chains, CVS, Walgreens, Duane Reade, the rest of them, they aren't sitting idly by. They are preparing for this. As a matter of fact, they have their own freezer capabilities. They have, in some cases, getting ready with tractor trailers that will essentially be able to hold the vaccine for as long a period as possible. They have their own lines of distribution ready. And what everybody should remember, it's going to be very difficult. We won't know because the Trump administration will be out when the bulk of these vaccines start to get deployed. But the military is playing a background role. The New York Times had a great story. You sent it to me, David, recently about the background role the military is playing. They don't want to be up front. They don't want to ever have somebody in a uniform giving a shot to someone. They don't want to have, a Humvee rolling down the street and say, oh, there's the new Pfizer vaccine coming in locked in a freezer. But they are helping on the distribution. They're presenting packs and they're putting together packs of needles and swabs and everything else that might be needed. As a matter of fact, one of the difficulties that the pharmaceutical companies had was to get the volunteers for the trials, because this wasn't a normal process where you put out your normal advertisements and you ran all types of notices on social media and said you were looking for volunteers, and then 100 people would show up at the University of Miami Hospital, for instance, and they would weed through a questionnaire and you would pick the ones that you wanted. This was COVID. You weren't able to get together. You couldn't get together in groups in most of the states. So as a result, the military behind the scenes provided everything. And they were providing, in many cases, 63 different locations for volunteers around the country, almost all of it done in terms of a military background. They were providing, in some instances, these large double trailers that not only had wheelchair access and not only had bathrooms and septic tanks built into them, but in Florida, they were hurricane proof for the most part. So that's taking place, whether it's a Trump administration or a, and that's going to be essential in the background to making everybody else look as though they got their act together. And even in states where you have a governor like DeSantis here in Florida, who has not been strict in terms of saying, I'm going to close the state down. And, we're approaching in Miami-Dade again, near a 10% infection rate. Our numbers are going up. We were over 20% in the spring with a much higher number as well on a daily number. But we haven't moved to any type of close down. But on the vaccine, he's all over it. He says he's going to have it set up. The poorest in Florida, those who are ill, those who are most at risk will be getting it. No governor wants to go down as the governor who failed to give those who have comorbidity or those over 65 or frontline healthcare workers, failed to give them the vaccine because they weren't on top of this issue. So I think you're going to see them all trying to be as efficient as possible, even those who are in Republican states and otherwise haven't seemed as concerned about the lockdowns.
So here's a question. Are the different types of vaccines, are there contraindications? Is there any point in participating in an upcoming trial like, what's it called? Novavax?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, there's
what is that vaccine?
Okay, that vaccine is going to be similar to what I call as the traditional viral vector vaccine that they're looking at. I think that if that vaccine can work, there's nobody else doing an mRNA vaccine other than Moderna and Pfizer right now with BioNTech, as you said, because they have the possibility. Everybody else is doing a variation of one of two more traditional vaccines. But is it worthwhile to be in those tests? No question about it. And the reason I say that so emphatically, the AMA just issued November 9th, I believe it was, so it's not that dated, just last month, early part of the month, that the estimate is from drug companies, then they need 1 million more participants. They've had up to 500,000 different phases of the trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, most of them in phase 3, obviously. Then a number have dropped out, not all stay, but they think up to 1 million more people. This isn't something, by the way, the public might think that when the vaccines get approved for emergency use or they get approved for regular distribution in January or February, that game over, no more testing takes place. Absolutely not. Right now, as we're talking, there are 11 different vaccines in clinical stage 3 trials. There are over 50 in stage 2 trials. And I think it's like 300 that are still on the drawing board. Now, not all of those are going to get through. Not all the clinical stage 3 will get through. But there's a feeling that the more the drug companies who are slow, who are 6 months behind, still think there is a market for them. Even if the back of the disease has been broken, the pandemic fear is gone, they think there will be spikes of coronavirus down the road here and there. There will be a need for well-priced vaccines, and countries will be looking for them.
The Spanish flu lasted 4 years.
It's a very good point, because everybody thinks it's just the year that it broke, of course. And not only the Spanish flu last 4 years, we have these very optimistic, I saw Dr. Fauci on saying summer to fall of next year, everybody will be able to get a vaccine who wants one. Now, that's very interesting, because he's not saying summer or fall of next year we'll be over this and back to pre-COVID normal. We'll be running around in groups of 10 going out to dinner. He's saying if you want a vaccine and you don't have a reason to get it because you're over 65 or you have a comorbidity or you're a frontline health worker or you're in a care home or you're in a prison, you just are a healthy 25-year-old, but you decide a vaccine will be good for you because you're going to see your grandmother once in a while, you may not be able to get it until late summer or fall, because the demand beforehand is going to be so great and the production big, but not big enough. So if we have to wait to summer to fall for what I call the voluntary take on the vaccine, it's going to be around here for at least a year or more, that in the form that we're looking at with the numbers up and down.
Well, I have noticed that the demand for flu vaccine is at record highs, and that
Yes.
you have to make an appointment to get it, and the government's been pushing that. And also, do you worry that we're going to lose a lot more people between now and February?
Yes, unfortunately. I think even with a low death rate, there's no question as the infections go up, it will happen. I mean, we've been looking at 40% of those deaths in care homes, and unless we're able to protect those care homes pretty quickly, that death rate may stay within that range, and that's going to be pretty bad. And you said a second ago, David, very interesting about the demand for the influenza vaccine. You're right. Coming off its record low of 39% effectiveness for the year below, you think some people might say, oh, forget it. But this year, the demand has been tremendous. The vaccine manufacturers, Pfizer, Moderna, and others, will tell anyone who's listening, by the way, we haven't tested it with the influenza vaccine. We don't know if there's any synergy. We don't know if there's any interplay. We don't know if it increases the immune response, if one increases the immune response of the other, if it causes any inflammation. They don't believe so. On paper, it shouldn't, but we've all seen things in medicine that on paper should be fine, and then in practice isn't always. But, I think that most people will go ahead with both under the assumption and the belief from the CDC that they will mix okay.
So right now, we've only had data done by press release. We have not, been no studies in JAMA, no studies in Journal of Medicine. Do you think things might change when that happens?
Boy, I hope so. Well, what I mean by I hope so is I can't wait until we see real studies in medical journals, because it's overdue. The idea of releasing something as important as vaccine results on clinical stage 3 trials that are being rushed through as it is in record time, and now you're going for emergency use authorization in record time, and all we have is essentially, you're right, results by press release, which puts the stock price up of the company that has that press release that day, isn't the most assuring method of knowing how good the stats are and how valid the information is. We accepted at face value that they are being accurate in what they report, but we all want to see it in the Journal of the American Medical Association. We want to see it in Lancet with AstraZeneca. We need to see these studies in the details. The fine details are going to tell us which ones are the better ones or not. And you asked me early on, when we started this, which one would I take? I can give you a better answer after I read the medical journal articles, because then I will be able to pick apart the weaknesses that I think might affect me or be a risk factor for me or maybe concern me for whatever reason versus another vaccine. I can't tell that from the press releases.
So we're over, so I'm going to ask, explain to the audience, what is emergency use authorization? Do you have to apply individually? Do you have to, or do they just decide, what does that mean?
Yeah, so emergency use authorization, which Gilead has for remdesivir, a number of companies have for their therapeutics, is you've gone through clinical trials, you've gone through the testing phase, and you don't have anything in the testing phase that shows a serious adverse effect that would stop the testing or stop the production of the vaccine. There were, by the way, AstraZeneca had 2 serious neurological conditions with 2 patients. They described both of those as coincidental, meaning that they were already existing conditions that the patients then became worse during the time of the testing and had nothing to do with the vaccine. So although they were halted for a bit, they were allowed to continue. They didn't stop the testing. Once you get through that clinical testing and you don't have an event that stops it, you go before the FDA if you've cleared your clinical testing in the US, and the emergency use authorization literally gives you the ability, one by one, you have to apply for it. Every company has to go and make their case for it. You show all of the data, you have to discuss all of the side effects, and if the FDA believes that it should be given in that emergency use, your doctor says, this is a case in which Trump received it, as a matter of fact, when he received the untested sort of ability to take on what was an rDNA technique as a therapeutic, had not been approved even for emergency use. They made the exception for him. But for emergency use, your doctor can do it. Hospital can put you through on it. And in this case, the CDC is giving the guidelines we spoke about before, because essentially what they're saying is prior to the final approval, the emergency use can be used for these groups en masse. And we're talking about millions, because Pfizer expects to have 25 to 50 million doses by the end of December. Moderna might have a few meaning 10 million doses by the end of the month as well. They're all manufacturing the doses now, expecting to get the emergency use authorization, which normally is quite limited, but in this case will be broad, and then get the approval entirely. And that's when you'll see it in retail pharmacies being given out at Walgreens and CVS.
So that could take a while for FDA approval.
Yes.
That's going to be based on studies, right? Published studies.
That's right. And that, I don't think we're going to see that. So you raise a very interesting sort of conundrum here, and I'm not sure how this gets resolved. The emergency use authorization is normally very targeted. It's given, and the word emergency has some meaning to it, so that the FDA only approves it. Means it's a medication that has not yet gone through all of the published studies. They don't have the final bit of crossing every T and dotting every I. And as a result, they're approving it because it looks to be effective. There's no major adverse effect that looks as though it's going to kill you or leave you with a debilitating illness. And therefore, its benefits outweigh any of the risks that it sees at this stage. And in an emergency situation, doctors can prescribe it to you, and often to save your life, prevent you from getting an illness that would otherwise be debilitating or deadly. Now, are the companies going to be able to use these emergency use authorizations so broadly that they won't care that they aren't getting an initial approval to be able to send it out to all of the public places that will distribute it to John and Jane Doe? I'm not sure. There will be a limit to how many people on the CDC list can be on that emergency use. And maybe it is. You look, we have 21 million healthcare workers in the US and public health service workers. Not all of them deal with COVID patients. We have 2 million elderly, at least I've seen estimates as high as 4 million in care homes or facilities or at home care. So you're talking of millions of people who need the vaccine first under the emergency use. After that, they've got to get it approved in order to get it out, what I call the broader public.
So until that, okay, so for people who are on the fence, I mean, the best advice we can give them is to wear masks, be socially distant, and just be careful.
That's right. I mean, look, if for people who are really against vaccines, and I'm not just talking about the anti-vaxxers here, but people just are scared of vaccines. They don't really like them. They don't take they don't take the influenza shot every year. They think this one has been rushed. They're not sure about it. You got to wear them. You know, if you wear the mask, you have the 6 feet of distance, you take care of yourself, you don't get in large groups, you wash your hands all the time, you might be lucky and be part of the 30%. What I mean by the 30% is, 65 to 70% of the country or the world needs to be eventually given a vaccine in order to build up herd immunity. At that point, COVID is no longer really expanding. And if you're in the 30% who didn't get the vaccine and you stayed healthy until that time, you might have gambled on the right side of the equation. But, it depends on your take for risk. People stay away from the vaccine because they think it's too risky, but not to get the vaccine can also be risky, depending on how COVID mutates. There are scientists and doctors, as you well know, who are looking at COVID to see it's a slow mutating disease, virus. Thank goodness it hasn't mutated. It has what they call some deletion mutation, which means it does shed and change in the lab, but doesn't make it more virulent. So it hasn't changed as HIV and others have that make it a moving target. So the vaccine we give out now from Pfizer or Moderna or AstraZeneca won't be effective against COVID in 6 months because COVID will be so different. But that's not happening. So for the most part, you have to weigh the risk, which is scarier for you as a person taking the vaccine and having some attendant side effects if you're one of those in that small group, or not taking it and taking your chances that you'll stay healthy just with COVID.
Okay, well, you've given us a lot to think about, and you've given us a lot of knowledge. I really appreciate it, and thanks for being my friend. And I just also want to say, Pharma is a really great book. It's a big book, a lot of pages. You can use it as a paperweight also after you read it. So where can people get this now?
I used to say everywhere where fine books are sold, but once I published on March 10th, the next day the WHO declared coronavirus a pandemic and bookstores closed a week later, so I couldn't say that any longer. Now it is in fine books where books are sold everywhere, in bookstores and online. And David, I'm really glad to have had this conversation with you because I'm a follower, a subscriber to SWINY on YouTube. I see and watch your interviews, and they're always erudite, informative, and they're helpful. So I looked forward to this because I knew it was a chance to have a discussion about not just vaccines, but what I call the good part of the drug industry. We talked about that before. I think people often, when they read the book, focus on the most salacious stories. So the feeling that they have at the end is, oh, this is an industry all of crooks and thieves, and it's just terrible. And, when you see what's happening in terms of the vaccine development and the people inside the labs, you go back to the time, I have a chapter titled, Could You Pat in the Sun? Where literally on the polio vaccine, Jonas Salk was asked who owns the right to it in a CBS interview with Edward R. Murrow. He said, could you pat in the sun? Because he didn't own it, nor did the company. It was given out for everybody. So there are instances in here. They aren't often, and there are times when greed in the boardroom takes over for innovation in the laboratory. But right now, we're seeing innovation in the laboratory at the forefront for the vaccines, and I like it very much.
Okay, thanks again. And maybe in 6 months, you'll come back and talk to us again.
I'll be much smarter about looking back and knowing where the pitfalls were on the conversation today. Thanks. I'll look forward to it.
Okay, talk to you soon. Okay.
Thanks.
And thank you, Joe Bonner, for producing this. And we will post this on YouTube tomorrow for people who have missed it, so you can send it to your friends. And thank you, everyone who listened in. We got a very good turnout, one of the best ones we ever had. So people are very interested in this topic. So again, everyone stay safe, and be careful and try and enjoy things that you do. Okay, take care.
Great.
Good night,
Thanks.
everybody.